A blinding light. Copper. A pain unlike any other, both mentally and physically. That was all Drifting Star could see, taste, and feel upon opening his eyes to the sight of his current practical abode of nothing more than sturdy plastic walls. It took him little time to come to full realization of his surroundings and reality as he scrambled from the floor onto his weak and blood-stained hooves. On his hooves, all he saw out from him was his own transparent reflection staring back at him, his bloodshot, yellow eyes swollen and harboring a slight tint of red. His dark blue fur and black mane was unkempt and stained with dirt and blood, the same case being for the lining of his lower eyelids as well, seeming as if his life supply had somehow leaked from his tear ducts prior to his awakening. The shock overwhelming his senses drew a cold sweat from his pores lining his forehead, trying to figure out where he was and how he'd ended up here. However, as soon as he tried to even think back to before he had awoken, he immediately hit a wall, finding nothing but blank space in his memories. He didn't have amnesia because he knew who he was and could recollect a good amount of his past. Therefore, he just continued to stand in a state of absolute shock, fear, and confusion, completely lost and unaware of how he'd come to be in a plastic bubble.
Where am I?
He questioned himself in a shallow voice, briefly pausing before speaking again.
What the hell happened?
Upon closing his unanswered questions, without warning, he suddenly began to cough violently. They were so severe that he couldn't even stop to breathe, as if he had no control over his body's actions. What's worse was that each cough had exhumed a frightening amount of blood, splattering to the floor and onto his hooves. His throat and lungs stung with every violent hack, up until he found himself on the floor and struggling to catch his breath. He could smell the essence lingering from the crimson puddles all around him, feeling like there was no way to fight against his body's continuous desire to practically retch out his organs. Then, in a sudden abrupt seize, his body stopped coughing, finally allowing him to get his breathing pace back to a safe and steady rate. However, the violent episode had been replaced with tears almost instantly, Drifting Star's entire throat feeling as if it were ablaze with fire. He'd had strep throat before as a colt, but the unimaginable searing attacking his entire esophagus was something much worse than that. He writhed in agony on the bloody floor, trying to find some way to escape. But the horrid sight of his life supply all around him and the overwhelming taste of iron and copper staining his oral cavity made it impossible. Every breath he took only made it worse, but he didn't want to die either. Therefore, he did only what he could, curling up into a ball on the floor and sobbing, up until he passed out once again. Upon awakening the second time, Drifting Star had no idea how long he'd been out. His reaction was about the same, up until the sound of another voice grazed his ears, erupting from unseen speakers outside of his practical home of plastic.
Remain calm. Panicking will only cause a repeat of what you experienced 2 hours earlier. I assure you, you are in a safe place, and we have no intentions of causing you harm.
He debated on trusting the words of a stranger, even if he had indeed been put into a safe environment. With no other option, along with the fact that he didn't want to feel that pain again, he decided to play along and listen. He didn't speak a word, too afraid to speak anything, and as a reward, he was greeted by the voice yet again.
Very good. Now allow me to ask you a few questions, seeing we believe we know what's wrong with you, but need to be absolutely sure before making any further decisions to come within your area. The symptoms you're showing fall in line with something we originally had thought had been eradicated. But considering where we found you, you may be carrying it.
He nodded in compliance, somewhat relieved that he'd potentially found an answer to his burning curiosity.
Good. Now we proceed with the questions. But I must inform you, if you believe you can't answer vocally, then don't. Instead, use the pencil and notebook we provided you underneath the mattress within your quarantine bubble.
He jumped at the words, turning and just noticing that there was indeed a single mattress with no supports or sheets within his vicinity. It was strange, due to the fact that he knew he had awoken from the floor. Therefore, how had he ended up on the floor? The voice answered his question.
Don't be alarmed. If your condition is what we assume, the memory loss is most definitely possible as a side effect. Now into the first question. Are you aware who you are and your past?
He nodded as a confirmation, knowing this was one of the common questions asked by any doctor to a patient who had been injured.
Very good. Next question then. What is your name?
At the first try to even mutter a sound from his throat, he was met with an instant jolt of searing pain that caused him to immediately stop and abandon any attempt at speaking. Therefore, as the pony behind the speakers had instructed, he turned and walked over to the clearly aged mattress, retrieved his tools from underneath, and carefully wrote out his name. Once the message was written out, he turned the notebook to the outside of his bubble prison as if some pony were outside of it looking inward. Upon the next transmission through the speakers, he knew he'd succeeded.
That lines up with what my colleague and I see on your ID. So it seemed that you are indeed telling the truth. Please, do not worry. If you assume we plan to perform anything malicious with your personal information, we simply use it to identify you, Mr. Star, and anything goes smoothly, we will return your property to you.
For some reason, he could feel that the pony speaking to him was being genuine. He'd been manipulated in the past and could tell when a pony was lying through their teeth. But the way they spoke and addressed his concerns felt similar to when a mother calms a troubled colt or filly. However, trust was something to be earned, and he refused to let his own be blindly fooled. Therefore, he scribbled down another reply and returned it to the hidden cameras watching his every move.
I'll comply, but in return, you must answer my questions as well.
As you wish, Mr. Star. We will comply with your demands and promise to do our best to clear up anything you want to know. Now, if you're ready, we will move into the next and final question.
He nodded as a confirmation, not sure what was left to ask. He just did his best to play nice and allowed the stranger assisting him to speak.
What do you remember before waking up?
The answer to that was clear to him, so he quickly wrote out a simplified reply without a second of hesitation.
Nothing.
I see.
There was an eerie momentary pause before another response came. A response that clarified that it was his turn to start asking the questions.
Those are all the questions we have at the moment, Mr. Star. Therefore, as per your request, are there any questions you have for us?
He didn't hesitate, his mind buzzing with a plethora of questions related to his current situation, along with what he couldn't remember prior to all of this. Navigating the pencil with his mouth, he carefully wrote out his first request, knowing that in order for his unknown company beyond his plastic walls to keep milking him for answers, they'd have to answer. Once he finished, he turned the notebook to the hidden cameras and awaited the response to come.
Who are you? And where am I?
Another long pause followed, meaning the ponies beyond the telegraphic messages were in contemplation of how to answer his request. He had them pinned, and upon the response, he knew they'd practically surrendered, knowing he wouldn't give them anything if they refused.
Starting off strong, I see. Very well, Mrs. Star.
A short pause followed, the radio waves only being occupied by the sound of ruffling papers and folders being opened. It took a minute for an answer to come, but when it did, Drifting Star had been immediately thrown into his own predicament.
Mrs. Star, are you familiar with Equestria's darkest day?
Despite his memory being past whatever occurred less than 24 hours prior being stable, he had no clue about what the pony had stated. Never had he ever heard of such an occurrence, but from the sound of it, it seemed like a very grim day in history. He shook his head in response.
Then allow me to give you a little history lesson about one of the greatest tragedies in equestrian history. On a normal day, in a small area known as Ponyville, what was supposed to be a harmless product any pony could buy at any joke shop became the deadliest catalyst for the worst pandemic in history. In just a time period of no more than 43 hours, that town was eradicated by the virus, going from a population of an estimated 300 to a merely 3 residents. Over a period of 28 days, the princess that occupied that place isolated herself in her castle with 2 of her friends that were somehow still alive. In that time, she performed experiments in hopes of finding a cure to the pandemic, but instead accidentally ended up creating a monster that nearly became the very vessel that would spread the virus beyond Ponyville. This was discovered on the day of the princess's rescue operation, as much of the fact that the virus actually didn't kill its victims, but put them in a temporary state of hibernation to rebirth them into monsters. Luckily, the team leader managed to kill and destroy the body by burning it to ash, and had immediately alerted Princess Celestia to do the same with the other bodies that were awaiting medical examination in the Cancelot morgue. Cancelot has escaped a pandemic and extinction by merely hours, but there was still one more victim carrying the virus, and that was the monster Princess Twilight Sparkle had accidentally created, aka Subject 129-06782, aka Rainbow Dash.
He jumped. Those names rang bells instantly, and it immediately made his heart drop at the horrid truth that he'd been delivered. However, the pony wasn't finished and continued to tell the tale that seemed like something that could only occur in a fictional horror story.
Knowing time was of the essence. The same team that discovered the truth about the virus had worked to track down the last victim and eliminated her before she could produce offspring. Long story short, they found her a few weeks after the rescue operation of Princess Twilight Sparkle, having taken refuge in the pit of a once active volcano. You now see the amount of risk that eradication of that creature presented. But despite the risk, the leader, Captain Stronghoof, let his team down and took out that thing, drowning it in the lava that lay below the surface of her resting area. However, that tactic of eliminating the biggest threat to Equestria at the time came the loss of the entire squad that day. A bittersweet victory that cost hundreds of lives, and to this day remains the darkest period in history. A part of history that we originally had thought was buried with the termination of that monster, but has now returned. You see, in the time of tracking down that creature, Princess Celestia gathered a team of volunteers to seal Ponyville in a dome made of concrete. The very place we found you on the brink of death.
He jumped again at the close of those words. Memories began to flash before his eyes of the previous days, all of them carrying the imagery of the very pony he'd ended up in hell in Equestria with. His wife, Shimmering Moonlight. It was all coming back to him in a sudden culmination, and at the realization of what happened, he felt like he was going to be sick.
Mr. Star, is everything alright?
He didn't answer, too captivated by what was plaguing his mind in rapid succession. Too much for him to handle as he collapsed to the ground and passed out into a void of absolute darkness. "5 days prior. The ticking of the clock high above Drifting Star's head, along with his anxiety of the current scenario, made him feel like he was going to pass out. His wife was no more than a yard's length from him, laid out on a hospital bed, her lower belly exposed and bulged out as if she had swallowed a whole watermelon. Across from her was a monitor with the image of the watermelon that sat curled up in a fetal position. A watermelon that would sprout into their world in no more than a couple weeks. A moment that he was both excited and scared to death of coming to pass, knowing that once fatherhood began, it wouldn't end for the rest of his life, even past the day their son or daughter became of mature age. Today was the day that they'd finally learn of their growing foal's gender, seeing the past visits had been without confirmation. With the birthday approaching, it was more than likely that the gender could be determined easily now, but it had already been an hour, and there was no answer to the burning question. He and his partner, Shimmering Moonlight, had met in a bizarre way just 1 year prior. Drifting had offered her assistance to grab a can of oats from a higher shelf while shopping, due to her being quite shorter than the usual mare. He'd been getting his stash of goods for the month as he usually did, up until he'd glanced over to see a mare with tan fur, sparkling blue eyes, and a dark brown mane with blonde highlights just a short distance out from him on her back hooves, reaching for the top shelf where the last can of oats she desired sat. All they had taken was one glance and a kind act for the two to set up a date a couple days later, having chosen to dine out at a casual restaurant. That following meeting had been enough for the two to go a step further in the relationship, and had only grown closer over the following 2 months, up until Drifting Star had felt confident enough to pop the question. He'd taken Shimmering Moonlight to the beach and enjoyed a day of just bathing in the sun and keeping each other company. It wasn't until the sun had begun to descend under the still sea that he'd proposed and sealed the deal. Not long after, the two had wedded, and Shimmering had ended up pregnant after they'd agreed on wanting a foal to call their own. Over the past 9 months, Drifting had done his best to support his beloved in her pregnancy, the entirety having felt like an endless struggle. He'd gotten 2 jobs to keep them financially supported, and he'd hated both of them with a passion. However, his love for his wife was true enough to go through the hell that he'd subjected himself to, having wanted to quit so many times. It had all been worth it though, because now, in this moment, he would find out what they'd both created together. It was the greatest reward as a husband, and in no more than 2 weeks, he'd officially be a father and have a great life to look forward to, guiding his son or daughter to success. The thought of it calmed his nerves a little, a small smile having creeped onto his in the many thoughts of his life thus far with Shimmering.
"Oh, I believe we have something, Mr. and Mrs. Star,"
spoke the stallion dressed in a white coat positioned above Shimmering's bulged belly. His name was Dr. Stoneheart, and he was the middle-aged doctor who had been itching to know the answer to the gender of the foal inside Shimmering's body. He was kind and very into his occupation, always thrilled to identify the future generations of stallions and mares that were yet to enter their world and grow into mature ponies. Therefore, his excitement of finally finding the indication of Shimmering and Drifting's foal was warranted. Drifting immediately got up from his seat as if he were a colt rushing out of bed on housewarming.
Really?
Is it a boy or girl?
Hold on, you two. Let me double check to be absolutely sure. I don't want to make a mistake and disappoint you.
Gently and carefully, Stoneheart glided the ultrasound device along the diameter of Shimmering's bulged abdomen. On the monitor across the room, the image of the creature resting within was in full display. With heavy focus and analysis, Stoneheart checked over and over to be sure he was correct about the gender, and only after he checked enough times to be absolutely confident in his decision did he finally give his answer.
Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Star. It's a beautiful boy.
He answered, to which Drifting and Shimmering responded with smiles and hugging each other happily. The answer they'd been dying to know for months on end was finally in full light, and now they could finally get to working on many things before the estimated birthday arrived. Upon releasing each other, they turned to Stoneheart and spoke at long last, Drifting being first.
Thank you, Doctor. You don't know how happy we are to finally know.
He chuckled as he worked to turn on the lights and disassemble the ultrasound equipment, speaking some final statements upon finishing.
No need to thank me. It's what I do, Mr. Star.
Upon the close of those words, he turned his gaze to Shimmering, working to get up from the bed and onto her hooves.
I estimate no more than a week, Mrs. Star. Make sure to take it easy on yourself. No heavy lifting, or activities that could put a strain on your body. Just standard activity like walking and resting.
Gotcha. I'll stick to my usual routine as best I can.
Good. Take it easy, you two. And if I don't see you here again, I'll see you when it's time for your son to enter the world.
The two nodded, then with care and ease, exited the room, ready to return home and rest up for a long day ahead of preparing for the birth of their child in the near future. The couple had decided to wait a day before revealing anything to their fellow friends and neighbors, wanting to just have a night to themselves before the chaos of organizing a full shower became their priority. Therefore, they'd prepared a bowl of popcorn, turned on a movie, and had bundled up together on the couch. That was their simple idea of relaxing and bonding more in their growing relationship as husband and wife, and it was enough to satisfy their desire for a peaceful evening together. The movie choice had been something neither of them had seen, and now a single hour in, they were engaged enough to not bother getting up if they felt it. The show was a horror film about a group of ponies hoping to make it big, going to investigate an urban area that was composed of a bunch of hills. It had been intriguing from the first scene, and had both their eyes glued to the screen, seeing they were at the predictable part where the main characters decide to go into somewhere clearly dangerous where they'd encounter something malevolent and die.
These characters never learn, do they? If it's old, dark, and abandoned, you don't go into it.
Yeah. This may be a movie, but there's definitely ponies like these characters out there. You don't test fate when it's clearly signaling that whatever is in front of you is bad.
Oh, there are definitely ponies like that in reality. I know because I work with some.
That made his partner laugh lightly, knowing he was actually being serious. However, That comment arose a new subject that Shimmering had kept to herself for the majority of her pregnancy. A subject that she knew Drifting would just wave off as no skin off his nose, when she knew for a fact he had lied for her and their unborn son's sake. She didn't want to kill the mood, but now that the day was close for her pregnancy's end, she felt it was appropriate.
Hey, now that we know our foal's gender, and it's nearly time, can you promise me something?
Drifting found the statement a little out of place and sudden, working to pause the movie to address his wife properly.
What are you requesting?
You know what I'm saying, honey. Don't pretend like you don't.
Drifting sighed, his act having been seen through as if the mask he'd attempted to cloak himself with were transparent. He sat up and began to speak more seriously, not wanting to piss off his partner.
Shimmering, you know I can't just quit my job. With our son coming in no more than a week, we need all the bits we can get to support him.
Out of the sacrifice of you being in a toxic workplace that can reflect badly in the future, a bad environment can lead you down roads that can impact our marriage and relationship. And I'd rather not even take that chance.
Shimmering, you know that would never happen.
And what if it does, honey? Then I'm left on my own taking care of our son and making up lies when he asks where you are. Do you really want to subject us to that potential future?
His hooves were tied, and he could tell that no matter what he said, she wouldn't give up. Shimmering was a very stubborn and dedicated mare that didn't give up easily, and he knew that all too well. Seeing he had no way of winning this fight, he decided to answer with another question.
Of course not. But let me ask you this. What if I quit and can't find a job by the time the baby comes? If we can't pay the bills and provide our son with proper care and support, then there's no future to look forward to at all.
A solid argument, but Shimmering had been prepared for this conversation long before now, so she already knew how to answer.
I already have a solution to that, dear. I talked to Cherry a couple weeks back, and she already knows a place that would suit you fine. It pays well, gets you out of that celestial forsaken place you're stuck in right now, and assures a positive future for our family.
Drifting hadn't expected that to be her answer, and once again, he was left with no answer in mind. She'd come prepared and fully loaded to this conversation, and as much as he didn't want to admit it, he knew he had lost. He sighed in defeat.
What kind of job is it?
Shimmering smiled at the practical surrender, knowing she'd won and wouldn't have to worry about him going back to that volatile environment ever again.
Delivering the mail. Something mostly any pony can do. It's great exercise as well. Seeing us sitting in a cubicle for over 9 months has made that body of yours falter a little.
He couldn't argue about that, and found the new occupation a suitable replacement for his current hell in Equestria. He smiled, then turned to the side of the couch to dismantle one of the spare phones in the house. He dialed a number he was too familiar with, awaited the response on the other end, and listened upon the voice of his brute of a boss yelling in his ears on the other end.
Drifting? Why the hell are you calling me this late? It's nearly midnight, you dumbass!
The response was nothing unexpected, the demeanor being the same as when Drifting was doing his usual routine in his cubicle.
Hey! Answer me! You got a lot of nerve interrupting my night.
With the phone gentle against his right ear, he gave the ass exactly what he'd wanted to say for all of those months of torture.
I quit, you piece of shit.
He hung up the call instantly upon the close of his exclamation, raising his hooves into the air in celebration that he was free at long last. Shimmering joined him after carefully navigating off of the couch and onto her hooves, putting her right hoof on his right shoulder as a way of showing she was proud of him.
How did that feel?
He turned his gaze to hers, a smile painted on his face and chuckling in relief that he'd never have to see that ass ever again.
Amazing.
I'm glad to see you happy for once. I could already see color coming back to your face.
He leaned in for a kiss, to which Shimmering accepted without hesitation. It was short and sweet, allowing them just a moment of solitude in one another's embrace before breaking and gazing into each other's eyes again.
Well, now that I'm not working tomorrow, why don't we celebrate by doing something together for the weekend?
What do you mean? We still have a full shower to organize. Plus, the baby could come at any time.
I know, honey. However, I think I have an idea that may work out, seeing this could be our last week of freedom before we officially enter parenthood. So, tell me, if you could choose any nearby place to get away to, what will you choose?
Shimmering put a hoof to her chin in thought, pondering on two things. The first was whether to go anywhere at all, even if it was nearby. And the second being that she would like to have at least one last taste of freedom before her young one was born. In other words, she was conflicted. However, after having taken a moment to think thoroughly, she gave an answer that seemed fair to both of her conflicts.
Why don't we do this? There's a nearby tourist attraction that I've always wanted to visit ever since we moved here. A place known as Blackwood Trail that is short and flat enough for me to walk along without overwhelming myself. We can take the shortest route that'll allow us to make it a one-day trip. And that way, if my water does break, we're close enough to make it to a hospital.
Drifting liked the idea, seeing he had always wanted to walk the Blackwood Trail as well. He'd heard of the gorgeous sights it has to offer, the travel being relatively friendly for any pony of any age, and also knew it was very close to their town. Therefore, he nodded, and with a smile still plastered on his face, gave his response.
That sounds great. I've heard that place harbors some of the most beautiful sights that nature has to offer, and that it's probably the least taxing attraction to traverse.
Then it's a date. However, we'll have to leave early if we plan to walk the entire trail. No more scary movies tonight.
Drifting nodded, then slowly led Shimmering from the living room to their bedroom, leaving briefly to shut the lights off throughout the house. Once every light was snuffed out, he returned to the bedroom and joined his partner in the bed, throwing the bed sheets over his body and snuggling against Shimmering's own body. The two were out in each other's embrace in no more than 5 minutes, excited for the next day's adventure to come. However, little did they know that the day they were looking forward to the most would become their worst nightmare. A nightmare that would spell out a whole new chapter in Equestria's existence.